For nearly 2 centuries, the petrified remains of Pompeii have functioned as humanity's most haunting time capsule, offering what seemed to be an impossibly intimate window into the final moments of those who perished when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 C. The plaster casts, created in the 19th century when excavators poured liquid plaster into cavities left by decomposed bodies, preserved not merely the physical forms, but what appeared to be the very gestures, emotions, and relationships of the victims. Tourists and scholars alike have walked among these frozen figures and felt a profound connection across 2 millennia, believing they could read the stories written in contorted limbs and desperate embraces. A mother sheltering her child, sisters holding each other in death, a wealthy woman clutching her jewelry as she fled. These narratives have been repeated so often, reproduced in so many textbooks and documentaries, that they achieve the status of historical fact. But a groundbreaking program of DNA analysis and forensic re-examination conducted in 2024 and early 2025 has systematically dismantled virtually every one of these cherished stories, revealing that what generations of observers believed they saw in the Pompeian casts was largely a projection of their own cultural assumptions rather than an accurate reading of the ancient past. The research, which represents the most extensive genetic study ever performed on the famous victims, extracted and sequenced DNA from 14 of the plaster casts, subjects chosen specifically because their poses had generated the most elaborate and emotionally resonant interpretations over the decades. What the genetic material revealed, when combined with new forensic analysis and careful examination of the casts themselves, amounted to nothing less than a complete reconsideration of how these individuals lived, died, and related to one another. The stories that had grown up around them, romantic and tragic and deeply moving, turned out to be almost entirely fictional, the product of Victorian-era archaeologists who shaped both the physical remains and the narratives surrounding them to fit the sentimental expectations of their time. Perhaps the most devastating revelation, the one that struck at the heart of Pompeii's emotional power, concerned the figures that had become the very symbol of maternal love in the face of catastrophe. Discovered in what became known as the House of the Golden Bracelet, 2 individuals preserved in an embrace that seemed to speak across the ages had been universally interpreted as a mother holding her child, protecting the younger from the volcanic fury with her own body in a final act of selfless love. The image had appeared on countless postcards and in innumerable history books, and the golden bracelet encircling one wrist was understood as a feminine adornment, perhaps a cherished family heirloom that the mother had tried to preserve even as she sheltered her offspring. The story was so perfect in its tragic beauty that no one had thought to question it. But genetic testing delivered an unexpected shock that shattered this narrative completely. Neither individual was female. Both were adult males, and DNA analysis confirmed that they shared no biological relationship whatsoever. They were not mother and child, were not even related, and further testing showed that neither man was connected genetically to other individuals found nearby in the same structure, effectively demolishing the long-held assumption that they represented a nuclear family perishing together in their home. The golden bracelet that had given the house its name and had seemed so clearly to be a woman's ornament, interpreted variously over the years as evidence of feminine vanity or as a touching symbol of maternal devotion, simply adorned a man's wrist. Researchers now suggest it may have been hastily grabbed as the individual attempted to salvage portable wealth before the volcanic fury overtook him, a desperate act of self-preservation rather than a tender gesture of maternal protection. The embrace itself, so long read as a mother's sheltering of her child, might represent something entirely different. 2 men seeking comfort from each other in their final moments, perhaps, or one man trying vainly to shield another from the horrifying spectacle of the mountain's destruction. What it almost certainly does not represent is what everyone for 200 years believed they saw. Similar revelations emerged from the house of the Cryptoporticus, where another pair of figures locked in an intimate embrace had generated their own elaborate interpretive traditions. Over the decades, these individuals had been variously described as sisters holding each other in death, as young lovers unwilling to be parted, as female relatives comforting one another as the end approached. The tenderness of their pose, the way their bodies seemed to intertwine, had inspired poets and novelists and filmmakers to imagine their story in ever more elaborate detail. Genetic testing indicated that at least one, and possibly both, individuals were male, forcing scholars to reconsider the nature of their relationship entirely. The romantic and familial interpretations that had been layered onto these bodies over nearly 2 centuries, researchers argued, revealed far more about the assumptions of those doing the interpreting than about the actual people who died in the eruption. The problem, the research team discovered, extended well beyond the genetic misidentification of sex and relationship. Examination of the casts themselves revealed that they had been considerably manipulated and likely creatively restored since their original excavation in the 19th century. Early archaeologists, working within the cultural frameworks of their era, sometimes adjusted body positions or reconstructed features to align with the sentimental narratives popular in their time. The casts were not, as generations of visitors had assumed, pristine and accurate records of ancient death poses. They were artifacts shaped by Victorian sensibilities, by the desire to tell affecting stories that would move museum visitors and sell tickets to exhibitions. The alterations compounded the interpretive challenges facing modern science, because what researchers were analyzing was not simply the preserved remains of ancient bodies, but those bodies as modified by 19th century excavators who had their own ideas about how dying Romans should look. The DNA analysis did more than correct individual stories, however. It painted a radically different picture of Pompeian society itself, challenging the assumption that the city's population was predominantly Italian in origin and character. The genetic data revealed ancestry primarily tracing to immigrants from the eastern Mediterranean, demonstrating that Pompeii functioned as a genuinely cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic hub within the Roman Empire. Individuals whose remains were tested showed genetic markers linking them to populations in the eastern Mediterranean, suggesting that Pompeii was a city of migrants, of people who had traveled across the sea to seek opportunity in this prosperous Campanian port. This finding fundamentally challenges traditional depictions of Pompeii as an essentially Italian city, a provincial Roman town where Latin was spoken and Roman customs observed. Instead, it positions Pompeii as a dynamic crossroads where peoples and cultures from across the Mediterranean world converged and intermingled, where Greek might have been as commonly heard as Latin, where customs from Alexandria and Antioch and Ephesus shaped daily life alongside those from Rome itself. The cosmopolitan nature of Pompeii's population makes sense when one considers the city's location and economy. As a port city situated on the Bay of Naples, Pompeii was connected to maritime trade networks that extended throughout the Mediterranean. Its prosperous industries, particularly the production of fish sauce and wine, would have attracted merchants and workers from across the Roman world. The presence of Eastern Mediterranean genetic markers in multiple victims suggests that migration to Pompeii was not a rare phenomenon, but a fundamental characteristic of the city's demography. Families may have maintained connections to their homelands while building new lives in Italy, creating a community that was culturally and genetically diverse in ways that previous scholarship had failed to appreciate. The research also refined scientific understanding of how Pompeians actually perished, revealing that the causes of death were more varied than previously recognized. Analysis of 2 non-cast skeletons discovered elsewhere in the city showed they died not from inhaling volcanic ash or from extreme heat, which had been presumed to be the primary causes of death for most victims. Instead, forensic evidence demonstrated that these individuals were crushed when collapsing walls fell upon them during the severe earthquakes that accompanied Vesuvius's eruption. The distinction matters because it suggests that the experience of the eruption varied considerably depending on where in the city victims were located and at what stage of the catastrophe they perished. Some died from thermal shock, instantaneously killed by the extreme heat of the pyroclastic surge. Others suffocated as ash filled their lungs. Still others, as these skeletons revealed, were killed by structural collapse, their deaths caused not by the volcano directly, but by the seismic instability it produced. Even long-standing assumptions about social status and wealth distribution came under scrutiny as a result of the new analysis. One particularly instructive case involved a skeleton discovered with valuable jewelry, including gold and pearl earrings, that had been consistently identified over the decades as a wealthy female property owner, perhaps the mistress of the house where the remains were found. The jewelry seemed to tell a clear story of privilege and status, of a woman of means who had attempted to flee with her most precious possessions. New analysis suggested a far more complex scenario. The individual may instead have been a household member, perhaps a servant or trusted retainer, attempting to flee with portable wealth that belonged to the estate rather than to herself. The presence of valuable items on a person's body, the researchers emphasized, does not necessarily indicate ownership. In the chaos of the eruption, individuals might have grabbed whatever seemed valuable, whether it belonged to them or not. A loyal servant might have tried to save her mistress's jewelry. A thief might have seized the opportunity to plunder an empty house. The simple assumption that jewelry equals wealthy female owner, the research demonstrated, represented another instance of projecting modern assumptions onto ancient remains. The implications of this research extend far beyond the correction of specific historical details. What the genetic analysis and forensic re-examination have revealed is the profound extent to which modern observers, including trained archaeologists and historians, have tended to see in the past what they expect to find rather than what is actually there. The 19th century excavators who created the casts operated within a cultural context that had very specific ideas about gender roles, family structure, and appropriate emotional expression. They expected women to be nurturing, mothers to be self-sacrificing, families to die together, lovers to embrace in their final moments. When they found bodies arranged in poses that could be interpreted to fit these expectations, they interpreted them accordingly, and sometimes they physically manipulated the casts to make the poses conform more closely to their preconceptions. The 20th century scholars who inherited these interpretations did not question them, in part because the narratives were so emotionally satisfying, and in part because the tools to test them did not yet exist. The stories of the mother and child, of the embracing sisters, of the wealthy woman with her jewelry became fixed in the scholarly literature and from their past into popular culture, where they achieved the status of established fact. Generations of visitors to Pompeii and readers of books about the disaster absorbed these stories as truth, never suspecting that they rested on nothing more substantial than Victorian sentimentality and the human desire for tragic beauty. The research team emphasized that their goal was not simply to replace old narratives with new ones, to substitute one set of stories for another. They acknowledged the temptation to create new interpretive frameworks, to construct alternative narratives that might prove equally appealing to modern sensibilities. But they cautioned against this impulse, arguing that the genetic results should instead prompt reflection on the dangers of making up stories about gender and family relationships in past societies based on incomplete evidence filtered through contemporary assumptions. The true lesson of the Pompeii DNA analysis, they suggested, is methodological humility, the recognition that the past is often stranger and more complex than our narratives can accommodate. This humility extends to the recognition that even the new genetic data must be interpreted carefully. DNA analysis can reveal biological relationships and ancestry, but it cannot tell us about the social relationships that bound these individuals together in life. Two men embracing in death might have been brothers, lovers, friends, or complete strangers who happened to die in close proximity and whose remains were later arranged by excavators into an embrace that neither would have recognized. The genetic evidence that they were not mother and child does not tell us what they actually were to each other, and the researchers cautioned against rushing to fill that interpretive vacuum with new stories that might prove equally unfounded. The cosmopolitan ancestry revealed by the DNA analysis similarly requires careful interpretation. That individuals had genetic markers linking them to the Eastern Mediterranean does not necessarily mean they were recent immigrants or that they identified with those ancestral homelands. They might have been descended from families that had lived in Italy for generations while maintaining genetic connections to their original populations through endogamous marriage practices. They might have considered themselves fully Roman while retaining physical evidence of their family's migratory history. The genetic data opens new questions rather than closing old ones, inviting further research into the complex patterns of movement and identity in the Roman Empire. For the millions of people who have visited Pompeii over the years and felt moved by the casts, the new research may come as something of a disappointment. The stories that made the victims feel accessible, that created an emotional bridge across 2,000 years, have been revealed as fictions. But in another sense, the truth is more remarkable than the fiction. The real people of Pompeii were not characters in a Victorian morality play, acting out predictable dramas of maternal sacrifice and familial devotion. They were complex individuals living in a cosmopolitan city, connected to networks that stretched across the Mediterranean, whose final moments were as varied and unpredictable as their lives had been. Some died alone, others in the company of strangers. Some were crushed by falling buildings, others suffocated by ash, still others killed instantly by heat beyond imagining. Some carried jewelry that may or may not have belonged to them, embraced people who may or may not have been related to them, died in poses that later excavators would reshape to fit their own expectations. The researchers involved in the study expressed hope that the new findings would not diminish public interest in Pompeii, but rather deepen it, replacing sentimental certainties with more complex and therefore more interesting questions. The casts remain what they have always been: direct physical connections to individuals who lived and died 2 millennia ago, preserved by a unique combination of natural disaster and archaeological ingenuity. What has changed is our understanding of what they represent. They are not illustrations of familiar stories, but challenges to easy interpretation, reminders that the past cannot be reduced to comfortable narratives that simply reflect our own assumptions back at us. For nearly 200 years, visitors to Pompeii have looked at the plaster casts and seen reflections of their own ideas about love, family, and sacrifice. The new science suggests that the real people preserved in those haunting forms lived and died in ways far more complex and unexpected than anyone had imagined. The mother and child were not mother and child. The embracing sisters were not sisters. The wealthy woman was likely not wealthy and probably not the owner of the jewelry found with her remains. What remains, after the dismantling of these narratives, is something perhaps more valuable: the recognition that the past is genuinely foreign, that ancient people did not organize their lives and deaths according to our expectations, and that understanding them requires not the projection of familiar stories but the patient, humble work of scientific investigation combined with interpretive restraint. The casts of Pompeii, stripped of their sentimental narratives, stand as witnesses not to the universality of human experience, but to its irreducible particularity, to the impossibility of ever fully knowing what transpired in those final terrifying hours when the mountain exploded and a city died.